Happy birthday, Louis Armstrong. Never gonna get tired of saying that. Again, thanks for coming to the Satchmo Legacy stage. We have two great researchers up for you next. Bjorn Barnheim is a trad jazz researcher and jazz researcher in general, who has spent lots of time in New Orleans with stuff on Louis Armstrong. Dr. Bruce Raeburn is a curator emeritus currently? Or?
Emeritus, that's correct.
I'm curator emeritus of the Hogan Jazz Archive, and a great resource and help to researchers around the world. So they're going to talk about Armstrong in Sweden. So, gentlemen, take it away.
Thank you, David. And greetings to everybody. Happy birthday, Louis. I want to thank the French Quarter Festival Incorporated for inviting us again. This is our third time tag teamed at Satchmo Summerfest, and it's always a pleasure to work with Bjorn Barnheim. So please, let me ask you for a round of applause for our guests from Sweden. First thing we probably want to establish is that Sweden is pretty far away from where Louis Armstrong was living, and Bjorn, of course, is European, and so he told us it's 6,700 kilometers from New York City to Stockholm, Sweden. How many miles would that be? 4,163.137. There were 8 trips to Sweden by Louis Armstrong between 1933 and 1965, and we're going to do our best to cover all of them. And so this is really the beginning of a story, and this wonderful photograph of Louis, I don't know how many people have seen it before, carries an inscription, and I'd like Bjorn to tell us a little bit about who was the recipient of this autograph from Louis Armstrong.
Louis had this photo as a promotion picture, and he signed it to a lot of musicians in Sweden. And this example is to trumpet player Tore Erling, who later became one of the best trumpeter we had in Sweden for many years. He died in 94, and he was born 1912, so he was just 21 when he met Louis in Stockholm, 1933.
Later on, we'll see a cartoon. Armstrong could have the opposite effect for trumpet players, too. They hear Armstrong, they give up the trumpet. So let's talk about this band a little bit, his Hot Harlem Band. You don't normally see that. Tell us about the background of this first trip to Sweden in 1933. Who was in the band and how it came about?
He went to England in the summer, I think it was in July, and he had some arguments with his manager at that time, Johnny Collins, and he fired him. And in England, he had been the year before and became good friend with
Jack Hilton.
Jack Hilton, yeah, sorry. And Jack took care of Louis during the autumn of 33 and got together this band. Most of the musicians were playing in Paris, and some were from Cuba, some from America, and made this tour up to Scandinavia and then to the Netherlands on the return.
Is this the same band that we see on the film from Copenhagen?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the clarinet player, Peter de Conger, was also from New Orleans. He was born 1903.
Hilton was pretty popular as a band leader in France and elsewhere, so this was really a portentous connection for Armstrong because, as you'll see, the Swedes really took to his music, but it was kind of uneven at first. We're going to look into that a little bit too. But when he went to Sweden, they worked him hard. This is, let me see, originally I think Hilton had set up 3 concerts, and ultimately they ended up doing 9 concerts. So Bjorn, why don't you tell us a little bit about what the parentheses, the numbers in parentheses mean?
That means the number of concerts that night.
So how come they went from 3 to 9 concerts?
It was well known in Sweden about Armstrong as a record star. And the arranger didn't believe he could sell out one concert. So they estimated one concert in Stockholm, one in Gothenburg, and one in Malmö. Malmö is just opposite Copenhagen.
Mm-hmm.
And the demand for the tickets sold out in just a few hours for the first concert. And then they arranged more concerts. So 3 concerts became 9 concerts at the end. And probably they could have sold more tickets in Gothenburg and even in Malmö.
So once they realized there was some money to be made,
Three
they hopped
extra
on it.
in Stockholm, 1 extra in Gothenburg, and 2 extra in Malmö.
In your research, you were able to uncover some memorabilia related to that first trip. I think this material comes from Orkesterjournalen.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about, for example, it tells us how much to get in to hear Louis Armstrong in 1933. 2 krona. How much is that worth in American money?
I guess it was about $1.
Ah. Sounds like a pretty good deal.
And the funny thing is that they were announced as the Americans' most popular jazz band. And I guess Peter the Conga and the drummer came from America.
Well, the Swedes didn't know the difference. The photographs are loads of fun, obviously, and so there's a caption on this one, but will you tell us a little bit about the circumstances under which this photograph was taken and the work you've done on trying to identify who these Swedish musicians are?
There are some maybe famous later, but probably this was a band playing in a restaurant for dancers.
Mm-hmm.
And Louis had a night off in Stockholm and went to this restaurant. And it's funny because in Chicago, he was famous on the south side of Chicago. This was the south side of Stockholm.
Right at home. So you're still working on trying to identify these musicians, and Bjorn's done tremendous research. Initially, our first 2 presentations were about return trips to New Orleans, and now he's covering Sweden, but this is ongoing research, and so maybe we'll find out more in the future about who they were. It's another photograph, and you can see that Louis met a lot of people while he was in Sweden, and everybody who met him fell in love with him. As you could tell, the 3 ladies in the background, the smiles on their faces sort of tell the whole story. But tell us about the lady in the foreground with Louis and the big smile on his face.
It's the famous singer Marian Anderson. She happened to be in Stockholm at the same time as Louis, and she made 11 concerts in 4 days in Stockholm. And she was very, very popular in Scandinavia. And when Louis had this fight with Eisenhower in 57, when the Little Rock incident happened, she was one of the first to defend him.
Friends to the end. Some interesting documents were collected during that first trip in 1933. And tell us a little bit about the story of the documentation accomplished by the Swedish Broadcasting Corporation.
They decided suddenly on Saturday, when Louis played the last concert in Stockholm, to change the radio program in the evening to send the second half of the concert live. And they used a telephone line from the auditorium where he played up to the radio station. And the telephone company had just recently installed equipment where they can record it on disc, the sound quality of the telephone conversation. So the man who was responsible for this equipment, he went down to his work on Saturday evening and recorded 3 tunes from the concert. And some expert says that this can be the first live concert that was recorded. And these 3 tunes are issued now on CD. Storyville has issued a set of 4 CDs, Louis Armstrong in Scandinavia. Oh. And they are second on the first CD. The first tracks are from the film made in Denmark.
Ah. We're
the
all
soundtrack.
familiar with that. And that material was sort of lay dormant for about 20 years or so
Yeah,
before it was
it
discovered.
was in the mid-50s, Gösta Hägglöf heard a rumor that there were recordings from 1933, and suddenly he found this man who had been working at the telephone company. He had these 3 discs, so they were survived.
The reception of black jazz musicians from the United States and Europe was potentially uneven. There was a whole sort of romanticism based on African primitivism that was applied to jazz musicians. And it happened in France, it happened in England, and it happened in Sweden too. Bjorn, why don't you tell us a little bit about Bertil Almqvist and Aftonbladet and the background of this image, which, you know, on the face of it, I mean, you heard Maxine, this is negative imagery. This is a negative caricature.
This is how this newsman from the Aftonbladet, it was an evening paper, and it was his impression of what he thought he experienced during the concert. That Armstrong was, if you see this film from Copenhagen, he's running on the stage, rather funny.
Extroverted, yeah. If you look closely, though, the 3 people in the audience, the guy in the far left is like really freaking out and obviously trying to defend himself by putting his hands over his ears. But the woman seated in the middle is like absolutely responding in a very positive way to this performer. And the guy on the right is too. So as opposed to some of the English and French audiences, we can say that 2 out of 3 Swedes really dug Louis Armstrong.
I think it was the opposite.
But then there's the critics. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Gösta Nyström and Gösta Raeburn and some of this commentary, which really is extremely negative.
Jazz was not too new in Sweden at that time, but the problem was with the daily papers. They sent people who were educated in classical music, and they didn't understand the jazz, the new music, if I say so. And at the same time, Hitler was coming up in Germany, and there was a wave of new, how to say, social behavior in Europe. And there was a racism going on. And probably that's why the reviews were very racistic.
Absolutely, and the current slide that's up there now gives you some context on what's happening with the political scene, the deterioration of what had been attempted to be liberal governments in Europe and were all swinging to the far right. And the rise of fascism in Europe obviously had racial implications. So even though it was present before the rise of Hitler, it got much, much worse when people like Hitler came to power. This is an advertisement for 1933, and it's interesting because there's a reference to what appears to be a Betty Boop cartoon called "I'll Be Glad When You're Dead, You Rascal You," that was made by Paramount. And there is also a signature and some writing, and I think Ricky validated that this looks like it's Armstrong's writing. And if you go to Klaus Strateman's filmography on Armstrong, you'll find that Armstrong, the Rhapsody in Black and Blue that he made for Paramount and the Betty Boop cartoon, he was not paid very much money to make those. But he got a great deal, which was they would distribute that material so that wherever he was playing in concert, these films would be showing and would publicize and bring the public into his world. So, Bjorn, you want to tell us a little bit about this particular advertisement?
It was published in the Stockholm newspapers the same day he left for Gothenburg. And it says that I have left Stockholm, but you can still see me at the cinemas. And it was 4 cinemas that show this Betty Boop cartoon.
Okay. Earlier I mentioned a cartoon that is in fact positive in its implications. So Bjorn, why don't you tell us, since I don't think that many people in the audience read Swedish, what that last caption says?
The last one says, "For sale, one fine trumpet, Fimpen."
So this is a trumpet player who goes to a Louis Armstrong concert, and his next move is, I'm not going to play trumpet anymore, that thing's for sale.
And this cartoon was made by a trumpet player, Gösta Turner, who became one of the best in the traditional style in Sweden. And he was just about 20 when he met Armstrong. And there is a story. He went up to the hotel, knocked on the door, and Louis let him in. And during the conversation, Louis said, "Do you want to smoke?" And he took a cigarette. And after, he said, it was a very, very strong cigarette.
So that was the first trip in 1933, and it took a long time for him to come back because a little thing called World War II kind of complicated, there's that word again, the situation for American artists, jazz artists. But he does make it back in 1949, and this is a piece in Downbeat that tells us a little something, but it's not quite accurate because of some special conditions that apply to that second trip. Bjorn, why don't you tell us about what happened with his arrival at the airport and why this Downbeat article from November 18th, 1949 is incorrect?
I think the flight time was the double compared to today. And today it's 8 hours from New York to Stockholm or vice versa. And if we estimate about 15, 16 hours flight, when they were over Scotland, the captain estimated that they were about 2 hours ahead of schedule. And he got a report from Stockholm that thousands of people were traveling out to the airport. And the captain on the aircraft, he went to Louis and asked, "Do you mind if we go down in Copenhagen and wait till we are on schedule and approach Stockholm at the right time? Because thousands of people are going out to the airport to meet you." So Louis said, "It's okay for me."
I don't think United would do that now, though.
And there were one band playing at the airport, and then there was a column into the city with a lot of bicycles, and on a lorry, another band was playing Louis' recordings or tunes. It was Jack Lidström's Dixieland Hepcats, and they became later on more or less the Swedish version of the All-Stars.
Ah. Well, speaking of which, the band that came in 1949 was the All-Stars, and you can see Velma's with them, Jack Teagarden, Barney Bigard, etc. And as usual, they've got their work cut out for them. But in this case, it's 5 concerts as opposed to 9 that they did in 1933.
We can mention that the first stop in Stockholm was at Vasaparken, and the band was introduced from the stage, but they didn't play. It was about 40,000 youngsters in the park. They have a teenage festival.
That's a big crowd, and obviously, you know, they love Louis Armstrong. They turn out for him. This picture from October 7th from Estrade. Why don't you tell us about that? Who's the woman in the picture, the microphone?
It's Alice Babs. She was a singer, and she made earlier in May '49 great success in Paris at the first international jazz festival in Europe. They sent an all-star band from Sweden. And the guy who arranged this trip to Paris, he was having these concerts in Sweden also. So he asked Alice Babs to be hostess at the reception party when Louis arrived. And when Louis heard that she was singing, he invited her to the extra concert they played on the 7th of October.
Ah.
It was 2 extra concerts. And she was singing Sugar to the band. And it's a pity, the same day, Radio Sweden made a recording, an interview with Louis, but they didn't record anything from the concert.
Oh, it's too bad. This next image, Armstrong obviously liked to get out and meet people when he was in Sweden, just like he did anywhere else in the world. Tell us the circumstances of what's going on here, the young man in the wheelchair.
On one of the concerts, I haven't been able to find out which one, but he saw this guy in the wheelchair, and somebody told Louis that he is studying playing trumpet. So Louis took one of his trumpets and went down and gave this guy a trumpet. And he was 14 years of age at that time, but suddenly he died in '85. So I wasn't able to make any comments or interview with him.
But that world-renowned generosity that was Louis Armstrong. Obviously kept in touch with Alice Babs.
Yeah.
Tell us about this interview.
So
For
this
Radio
is
Sweden.
made after the concert on October 7th for Radio Sweden. And Radio Sweden was a department in the Swedish Broadcasting Corporation and was handling the programs for foreigners, and was broadcasted all over Europe.
Moving on to Orkesterjournalen from November 1949. And again, this is in Swedish, but I think fantastic success for Armstrong. We can all relate to that. Comment a little bit on contrasting this press coverage from what he got in 1933, because this is extremely laudatory.
Yeah, and now it was a person who knew about jazz, who wrote this
Ah.
review. And it's interesting to see the advertisement in the bottom. It says that Louis Armstrong made service of his trumpets at this firm.
And Downbeat is keeping up to date with Armstrong's activities in Sweden. And, the rubric at the top is turned into a riot. So how'd they have a riot at Louis Armstrong's performance? What's going on there?
So this is a review of the opening of the tour in Europe. And what happened in Sweden was high prices on the black market for the tickets to the concerts and so on.
40,000 people at Kings Park, a parade of 100 autos, 500 bicycles escorted him into town for the performance. So that's a big turnout.
And the funny thing is this paragraph saying at the concert there was 50 photographers, and after the concert they had to sweep up about 1,000 flash bulbs.
You remember those old blue things that
Yeah.
crinkled up when you used them? Yeah. That was a long time ago, obviously. Okay, let's...
Now we come to 52.
Third trip, 1952. So this time he has Lucille with him, and Jet magazine is covering his exploits. So he's making a big splash into the African American press as well.
And you can see he was flying with his Scandinavian Airlines system. For the second time, 49, he also took the flight from New York to Stockholm by SAS.
And with him, he has a new version of the All-Stars.
So Trummy Young had just joined the band before they went on tour. And Bob McCracken was on clarinet instead of Barney Bigard. And Martin Napoleon had come in instead of Earl Hines.
And they're moving around a little bit more. You know, on earlier trips they would do like 3 cities, but in 1952 it looks like they're really playing some new places.
Yeah, and the talks to Hugh Glazer in advance for the tour, they had estimated to start in Malmö on the 20th of September, but Hugh Glazer delayed this contract, so they had to skip the first week in Sweden. And it happened to be Eskilstuna and Västerås in the same evening.
So naturally, on this particular occasion, the downbeat coverage was based on information that had been supplied in advance, which was no longer correct because of the delays with Glazer. Well, let's look at this photo. Are these policemen in this photo? They look like they might be policemen.
No, there are servicemen at the gas station between Stockholm and Eskilstuna.
Oh, that's right. People used to hire people to pump gas.
Yeah. And the background to this picture is that on the way to Eskilstuna, Welma suddenly said to the driver, "I need a restroom, please stop." And the driver said, "Sorry, ma'am, we don't have any restrooms in the woods in Sweden, but I can stop at the next service station." And the rumor says that Louis took out his trumpet and played Pennies from Heaven.
Well, again, ticket scalping, wild crowds, broken records greet Armstrong in Sweden. And, you know, the love of the Swedes for Armstrong is something that's just growing steadily from 1933 on.
I have no explanation, but I think they took him to their heart. He was a good showman, good entertainer.
That is the understatement of the year. Okay, 1955, he's back again. So the frequency obviously is picking up here. And he tended to make Sweden his first stop when he did European tours.
He wanted a good start, I guess.
Yeah. Maybe, I don't know, do you think he liked the food? Okay, 1955, who does he have with him? There's Trummy Edmund Hall, Billy Kyle, Velma's still with him. And they really have a full agenda this time. 16 concerts in 6 cities. They're really working them hard. Tell us about, you know, some of the anecdotal material that goes with these performances.
They played 5 concerts, and the 3 first in Stockholm were all extra concerts. So together they played 5 concerts in Stockholm. And then they went out on the countryside, if I say so. And it's interesting, when they played in Lund, Akademiska Föreningen, it's a part of the university in Lund. One guy went up to Louis and asked, "Do you mind if I record your concerts?" And Louis said, "You Glazer wouldn't be glad. But if you hide the microphone and I don't see it, it's okay." And he recorded it, but it's still unissued.
Well, Ricky, get busy. Come on.
We have the pictures of the microphone.
Yeah.
I knew it. Okay, 1959, this is the 5th trip. And this is a wonderful cover of this magazine. How do you pronounce this, though? Is this C?
Sia.
And what does it mean? Sia.
See, look.
So the Swedes had their own version of Look
And
magazine.
the magazine was published from 38 to 81. And it was inspired by Life and Look magazines.
I think one of the reasons you like Sweden so much is the hats. They just,
And we go back to the hat later on.
yeah, there's more hats to come. Okay, this is the personnel in 1959. So again, it's another crew. It's the All-Stars, but they keep mixing it up, as was typical of the age. And they're playing lots of concerts, again, seemingly more than ever. One correction, however, at the very bottom, the Linköping, that is actually February 5th, for anyone who's tracking that.
So he played 19 concerts in 8 cities. And the 2 concerts in Stockholm, 18th of January, they were extra because of the demand for tickets. And the agency that arranged the tour in Sweden, they never learned how to sell the tickets. It was always more demands for tickets than they estimated.
Well, I wish I would have had one. This photograph, look at the audience, like they're all bundled up.
Yeah, it was 14 degrees Fahrenheit minus. And you can see how they're sitting with the furs and hats on. And it was a warehouse for air guns where they were played.
BB guns. Yeah, okay. Better than what we got. So they're not bundled up, but I mean, when you're performing, you generate a certain amount of heat, and Louis Armstrong, particularly, probably enough to warm the entire audience. And here's another great photo from 1959. And this is a reunion of sorts. Why don't you tell us about that one?
In 1933, he had a piano player named Justo Barreto, and his real name was Justo Nicolas Barreto Rodriguez, and he was born in Cuba 1905. And when Louis came up to Umeå, very far north in Sweden, they had a reception. The cultural department in town arranged a welcoming party and collected some people that were able to speak English. And when Louis came into this party, he saw this black pianist playing in the bar, and he said, "Oh, Tico Tico." It was his. He didn't know that he was playing in Sweden at that time. And in the textbook for these Storyville CDs, it's mentioned, and it says he lived in Sweden at that time. So I did a research on Amnesty and found out that he was living the rest of his life in Sweden and is buried. He died in 71, just a few months after Louis, and is buried outside Stockholm.
And that photograph was in private hands. The woman that's pictured there, you were able to obtain use of that from her.
I asked a friend in Umeå to get me a copy of this photo. And the funny thing is that about 50 years after he went to school, he found one of his schoolmates was in the picture. It's the young girl. And she never mentioned to him that she was at the party.
Her parents did not know.
And this picture cost me $100.
Well, there's that hat from Sia. And the drummer got one too, apparently. So hats for everyone.
Yeah, and that was at the concert in Umeå. It's a Laplander cap.
Okay.
And you can see Louis is trying to play with the Lovikka hands. It has no fingers, just for a thumb.
If anyone could pull it off, it would be him.
And they delivered this set for the first concert. And then the arranger asked them back so he could deliver for the second concert, the same set.
Okay, we're going to put on the Jets and go to the sixth trip in 1961. And here again, Orchestra Jonalen, February 1961. Great respect for Louis Armstrong in the Swedish press. You want to comment a little bit about or translate what that headline tells us?
I think it's easy even for you to read. The jazz ambassador is always welcomed guest.
And here are the number of concerts seems to be dropping off a little bit in the 60s. Do you think the sort of inroads of pop music and rock music might have even affected his popularity in Sweden?
It was the rock and roll and the Beatles era. So the agency didn't believe he could sell any tickets. But the two concerts on February 16 are extra concerts in Stockholm. Because they sold out the tickets for the two first concerts in 20 minutes.
That's it. Armstrong had a way of bucking the trend. You know, even if it's a strong trend with young people, he's going to find a way to get around it, as we all know. Seventh trip, 1962. And he's got Trummy with him. And Joe Derensburg, Billy Kyle, Danny Barcelona, Jewel Brown on vocals. And they are playing 7 concerts in 2 cities this time.
Yeah.
But a television show.
So in Stockholm, he recorded a TV show about 1 hour, and it was for something called Nordvision. It was a organization between the public TV companies in Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, and Finland. So it was broadcasted in several countries in the autumn '62.
And we've seen the picture of it, and now we have made it to the 8th and final trip, 1965. Tell us about who is in this picture.
It's Gösta Hägglöf. He was a great fan of Louis. He was a teenager in 1949 and heard all the concerts Louis played since then in Stockholm. And sometimes he traveled to other places also. And he died in 2009, and he donated his collection to the Armstrong Archive in New York. And when Michael Cogswell was in Sweden, I think it was the year after, he collected the all the things in 42 moving baskets.
And the band that he had with him, again, it's the All-Stars, and we see Billy Kyle's there, Jewel Brown's there, but also some turnover on that last trip. And number of performances is up in '65. It's a little bit more ambitious schedule than they had seen in the 1961 and '62.
I think the agency learned a lesson and understood that Louis was still selling the tickets.
He was still Louis Armstrong. And more hats. So tell us about where this comes from. Malmö Airport, June 10th, 1965.
When he arrived to Malmö Airport, he was greeted by the fire department, and earlier they had given this honor to Arthur Fiedler and Henry Ford II and Yuri Gagarin, who was the first spaceman. So Louis was the fourth, and I haven't found out anyone who has got it later.
Louis got a lot higher than Gagarin did.
And this is the front of the fourth volume of Louis in Scandinavia.
Well, it was big news because here it is, the Evening Star, Washington, D.C., and it's a news item there. But what's a little surprising is that the New Orleans papers didn't cover that news.
I haven't found any.
No, and it could be that there was still some hard feelings because Louis had not come back yet. In '65, he does return and sort of like allows New Orleans to honor him again. But maybe not, maybe this was premature. You did some digging to try to find memorabilia from that last series of concerts, and tell us about this memento. It's really what you were able to come up with.
I contacted Liseberg amusement park in Gothenburg, and they have a very good archive, but they didn't have the poster. They didn't have any of the advertisement for the newspapers, but they sent me a lot of reviews, not only in Gothenburg, but from other papers around Sweden that year, 1965. And then I happened to speak to a friend in Stockholm about this problem. And he said, I have the tickets from the last concert in Gothenburg. I was a student at a technical high school at that time. So he sent me this ticket.
So we have something.
And Louis signed the ticket after the concert.
That makes it extremely valuable. Well, to sum up, 8 trips to Sweden, numerous recordings were made while he was there. And Bjorn worked for Saab. He's about statistics sometimes, and so he compiled a kind of chart of the exploits of Louis Armstrong in Sweden. And, you know, we've got a great Louis Armstrong statue by Elizabeth Catlett in Armstrong Park, but the Swedes have their own. And Louis Armstrong's impression on Sweden is something that continues to run strong. It's why we're here. Louis Armstrong, a great human being, and it's nice to be able to reflect on the fact that his influence was totally global. So thanks very much for your attention, and may the spirit of Louis Armstrong live on forever. Thank you.
I can add to this picture of the figures. Louis is leading the group. Behind him is the former King of Sweden coming.
It's only fair. Thanks for your attention, everyone.
We made it on
Bjorn
time.
Barnheim. Dr. Bruce Raeburn,
On
give it up for
time.
him. Louis Armstrong, global icon. All right, so again, thank you for coming to the Satchmo Legacy stage. We have next up the great Vic Hobson, whose scholarship is I won't call it radical. Is radical the right word? Maybe. He's taking an entirely different, a new approach to how Louis Armstrong made music, and it's quite fascinating and slightly controversial, I suppose. So anyway, he's going to come up here and talk about this next time. So grab a drink and stick and then come on back. We'll be here.